I Hate Politics is a podcast about a human activity we love to hate. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. The local book to read this fall is called Disrupting DC: The Rise of Uber and the Fall of the City. Washington, D.C. was the sixth city where Uber started operating. But it is here that Uber was best able to mold the regulatory environment to meet its needs, including dismantling the powerful taxi cab commission and the working around the insurance and labor laws. The book is written by Katie Wells of Georgetown University, Kafui Atto of the City University of New York, and Declan Cullen of George Washington University. I caught up with Wells and Atto to ask them about the conditions that allowed Uber's entry into the city and the consequences of Uber consolidating its position in Washington, D.C. I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are dirty, messy, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians. But no matter how much we may hate politics, we are never exempt from it, even when we refuse to participate. In fact, the purpose of politics is to keep society functioning precisely when we don't agree with each other, like now. Music for this episode comes from Washington, D.C. composer, songwriter, and pianist Oren Levine. We are pulling music from his album Making Up for Lost Time. Barbara Papendrop and Aaron Myers on vocals, Lionel Lyles on tenor sax, and Herb Scott on alto sax. You can find more music from Oren Levine at ohljazz.com. In the news this week, the cities of Rockville and Gaithersburg are having elections November 7th. Early voting has started. Last week, we released double-header candidate interviews with Rockville mayor and council candidates, episodes 142 and 143. We were not able to do similar interviews with Gaithersburg candidates. The city of Gaithersburg also has a mayor and council system. 3 seats are up for election in this round, and there are 2 incumbents running, Neil Harris and Robert Wu. 4 first-time candidates are also in the fray: Jamil Hernandez, Shanika Whitehurst, Daniel Lukomsky, and Amadamola Williams. Incumbent Neil Harris has been widely endorsed by other political leaders in Gaithersburg, the county, and beyond. But incumbent Robert Wu has not received the endorsement of his colleagues. Generally, not endorsing incumbents is rare, and this weakens Wu's position. But incumbency and name recognition are strong predictors of electoral victory. Gaithersburg Mayor Judd Ashman has instead endorsed first-time candidate Jamil Hernandez, and Montgomery County Council member and former Gaithersburg Mayor Sidney Katz has weighed in on behalf of Shanika Whitehurst. In local elections, endorsements are campaign currency. They not only bring along some voters from the endorser to the endorsee, but also serve as a way to vet candidates and show off their networks and ability to work with others. The war in Gaza continues to ripple through locally. UMBC student Morgan Perlstein interviewed Rabbi Yosef Goldman of Sharei Torah Synagogue in the Kentlands about responding to local anti-Semitism for a class project.
Rabbi, can you tell me when the recent vandalism occurred here?
A week ago Monday, there were two separate incidents of anti-Semitic vandalism. One, the word kike was carved into a bulletin board at a playground in the Lakelands, and a quarter of a mile away in the center of the commercial district here in the Kentlands, there were about a dozen or more swastikas that were chalked into the pavement. We, over the past few weeks, have not seen other incidents of anti-Semitic vandalism in this area.
Are you in communication with other synagogues to form a plan as to maybe how to approach this in the future?
We are in communication with other synagogues. There is, for example, a Washington Area Board of Rabbis. The executive directors have a group, and we're also all in touch with a security network through the Jewish Federation, as well as with the ADL. So there is definitely communication among the synagogues in the greater DC area and in Montgomery County in particular. We have also in regular touch with the interfaith office of our county, and we're also in touch with a group of that organizes Jewish educators in the Montgomery County Public School District. The teachers are organizing themselves, and the broader Jewish community is trying to support them in addressing rise of anti-Semitism in the school district. And through the interfaith office, we are learning of an increase in Islamophobia here in Montgomery County in particular, which seems to parallel a trend more nationally as well. At this time when there is such division and hate, acrimony around the war in Israel and Gaza, we're starting to look for ways to organize among Jews and Muslims to address anti-Semitism and Islamophobia together.
This week saw a big pro-Palestinian protest on the campus of the University of Maryland. The Maryland chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations, CAIR, led another protest in front of U.S. Senator Ben Cardin's office in Rockville, and a third protest is planned on Sunday, November 5th, outside the Montgomery County government offices in Rockville. That would be calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has rejected calls for a ceasefire, and President Biden has strongly backed Israel and Netanyahu's retaliatory strategy against Hamas for its attacks on Israel October 7th. Biden's support for Israel is believed to have caused a precipitous drop in Muslim American support for the president and the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party, nationally and in the region, is divided between those who view the Israel-Palestinian conflict as a colonial war between settlers and indigenous communities of color, and the party's very robust Jewish foundation. 2 weeks ago, we had reported that local Muslim groups had not yet come out openly for the Palestinian cause, but with CAIR's protest, this has now changed. We like to think of political issues as self-contained buckets, but of course they are not. And balancing between vastly different issues is the function of politics. You might recall that through last spring and summer, CARE and other Muslim groups were involved in protests to force MCPS, Montgomery County Public Schools, to allow families to opt their children out of reading LGBTQ-themed books. The local Democratic Party establishment at that time had been unnaturally silent on the issue, standing back to let the courts decide the best move forward. But now the Democratic Attorney General of Maryland, Anthony Brown, has filed an amicus brief alongside 18 other states on the LGBTQ books opt-out lawsuit currently in the federal Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. The brief supports the idea that schools must be safe, supportive, and inclusive environments for all students, and that exposure to diversity in and of itself is not a violation of the constitutional rights of students and families, and that states have broad authority to determine the shape of curriculum. This has long been the standard of law in these matters in federal courts. Religious families, for example, have had the right to pull their children out of public school on the basis of belief, but they did not have the right to veto curricular choices by public schools. Earlier in September, the Commonwealth of Virginia and 17 other conservatively led states had filed their own amicus petition arguing for the constitutional rights of parents and that MCPS violated Maryland statute with respect to sex education curriculum. Maryland and the liberal states deny that this violation occurred. Given established doctrine, the Fourth Circuit is expected to come out on the side of Maryland and the liberal states. But the strategy of the Beckett Fund, the religious liberty law firm arguing the case, appears to be one of appeal, effectively going through the appeals process to present the case to a conservative Supreme Court bench, which they believe will move the law itself. In another innovative application of the law, Washington, D.C. Attorney General Brian Schwab has filed a price-fixing lawsuit against the software company RealPage and 14 of the largest apartment building landlords in the city, names like Bozzuto, JBG Smith, and Camden Development, among others. The case is unique because of the mechanism of the alleged collusion. The complaint accuses the Texas tech firm RealPage of providing a revenue management platform to landlords and property managers, which is then the venue and the tool for illegal price setting under DC antitrust law. Specifically, the lawsuit alleges that property owners and managers transfer rent data to RealPage and delegate the price setting function. RealPage not only coordinates rents across the market, but also enforces property owners do not deviate from their recommended rent suggestions. According to the complaint, RealPage's platform has been used to set rents for over 50,000 units in Washington, D.C. RealPage has also been sued in federal court in San Diego by renters following a ProPublica story about its price-fixing platform. In the last 2 decades, RealPage has come to dominate the rental revenue management software market, with the acquisition of several competitor platforms, and now uses its market power to enable price fixing on rents, the complaint alleges. DC's lawsuit represents a new use of the law because platforms are generally not held responsible for content and use. Normally, data transparency is believed to provide better information to market players, presumably making for better decision. But the platform should be available to the market as a whole, like the Bloomberg stock ticker service being equally available to buyers and sellers. Real page platforms are only available to property managers and owners. Tenants do not participate on the platform. It is also interesting that DC's case alleges violation of DC, not federal antitrust law, implying that state courts might be more willing to act in these matters than federal courts. Not far away in federal court in DC, another market domination case is unfolding. U.S. Department of Justice's lawsuit against Google for using its market power to destroy competition to its search engine and its advertising generation model. Lastly, some ironic numbers. The Maryland Department of Transportation gave the Tacoma Park Police Department $3,500 in a state grant to address distracted and impaired driving, $1,980 for distracted driving, and $1,485 for impaired driving. If you ever wondered how to measure Vision Zero efforts, here is your reveal. You're listening to I Hate Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. I'll be back with Kafui Atto of the City University of New York and Katie Wells of Georgetown University to talk about their book, Disrupting DC, The Rise of Uber and the Fall of the City.
I'm helpless, I'm hopeless. I walk around the house, it makes no sense. I'm feeling in a bind without you. Confusing, I'm losing my grip, so I sit and stop moving. I'm not in my right mind without you.
Kafui Atto, Katie Wells, welcome to I Hate Politics.
Yes, good to be here.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Congratulations on your book, Disrupting DC, The Rise of Uber and the Fall of the City. What were the conditions in which Uber arrived in DC?
Uber arrived in DC. It was the sixth city that it entered in 2011. The conditions were, this is, 4 or 5 years after the recession. There's been a number of kind of tech unicorns, and Uber has proved itself to be one of those. DC at the time, on one hand, they're in the middle of a kind of demographic transition. The same year that Uber arrives, DC, loses its status as a majority Black city, a status that it had held for, at least 40 years. So there was that in the air, and that kind of the anxiety questions surrounding that were kind of being were captured in the kind of debates between the mayoral candidates, broader racial kind of history, questions around gentrification were central to that.
In addition to those demographic shifts and the questions about the failings of the labor market in the DC area, right? The other really important piece of this was the metro and the crumbling transit system. Right. This is, in the midst of Metro from the get-go, right, was underfunded, and it's underfunded again, right? And it doesn't have the structural funding it needs. And so there were a lot of arguments at the time that Uber, sort of arrived to DC about, oh my God, right? Public transit doesn't work. The other important factor, right, does have to do with technology, which is that DC was one of the cities that had the largest early adoption of smartphones. That has a lot to do with the young professional population here, right? The over, like the over representation of college graduates and people with disposable income that could buy these new smart machines to put in our pockets. And so those are some of the other factors that led to sort of Uber picking DC, but also DC picking Uber.
And they were trying to solve one particular part of the problem that DC had, and that had to do with local transportation.
Part of that was the metro, and the other part was the taxis, which is a also a huge part of the story.
You say that Uber used DC, or in DC, Uber perfected its model. What was that model? Can you describe it?
I mean, on one hand, it was a new model of lobbying or advocacy. Some people call it entrepreneurial governance, right? It was a way of doing this thing called clicktivism, where suddenly, if you could imagine McDonald's could suddenly, text every single person who had ever bought something from the dollar menu and told them, please tell your council, tell your city, tell your state that, don't raise taxes on this item. Right? Suddenly, Uber was able to do that for anyone who had ever used its product. And that created a new flood into sort of the civic arena. And it looked in some ways like democracy, but we argue it's really more a form of sort of like a rebranded corporate loyalty that was masquerading as a kind of democratic politics. So that was new in DC, and they took that on the road. But also the arguments about racial justice and about disability justice. They also trialed those here and then have taken them on the road ever since.
So one just to add to that, I think part of that model is flouting the law. So just it's a strategy that rests on, or that relies on, simply ignoring the regulations on the books. It's a strategy of disobedience, so disobeying the laws, and then using what Katie was mentioning, with the clicktivism, to kind of beat back the inevitable kind of regulations around its operating. And so that what we do in the book is kind of lay out what that looked like in DC, what was called Operation Rolling Thunder, and basically, make the claim, because Uber itself made the claim that operation, that model was, would be repeated in city after city. So.
Yeah, but you said DC was the sixth city, right? And so why not the others? Why here?
So DC was the first place where they faced municipal resistance or pushback, right? And DC is important because of the federal representation here, but more importantly, because we are in that city-state guise. And so once they could get DC set, they did not have to worry about state preemption, which is something they were subject to in places like Texas, but also in other cities that they were operating early on.
So like in Seattle, didn't work. In New York, it didn't.
So there were different battles that were playing out there, but in those cases, they had more than one set of regulators that were involved in the battle, right? DC was an easier marathon to run because once they got these 13 council members, boom, the door was closed to any further oversight unless it came from the federal government.
And in places like San Francisco and Seattle, you might have found instances where Uber drivers were fined, or I don't know if jail, but certainly fined, because in San Francisco this was the case. But none of those cities took up questions of regulation, in their governing bodies. So DC is the first place where you really do see kind of legislative pushback. And it's the first place you see that pushback defeated. So that's why,
It's where they were,
it makes
Sunil,
it
it's where
kind
they
of
were also
unique.
sorting out questions about insurance. Like, should the city require these companies to hold a certain level of insurance, like commercial insurance for passengers and drivers and things like that? Like all these questions about this entity and whether it really was a new business category were being sorted out here.
Right.
What,
I understand. So the thing that is sort of perplexing to me is why here? I mean, shouldn't insurance have been an issue in Seattle or in San
but it
Francisco?
wasn't
Or
getting legislated, but it hadn't been legislated yet, right? There were all kinds of rules. There were other kinds of things where like a city's well, now we call it a Department of For Hire Vehicles, but it used to be called a taxi commission, or in California it's like a public utility or commit. I don't remember the name of these different agencies, but there were other regulatory bodies that were getting involved, but those were not legislative bodies, right?
Mhm.
That they were certainly going through all kinds of little struggles, but it was a very different kind of confrontation than what rolled out here early on.
What social costs did Uber impose on DC? And were these costs greater than the cost of governance failures that existed prior in DC, particularly with respect to the taxi commission, which you describe in quite great detail?
The social costs of Uber move forward in time. And that is what scares me. And that is what's going to lead me to say, today, I believe the social costs are greater of Uber than these other failures because it is, we think, and Uber is endangering the city's ability to pursue more meaningful investments in public infrastructure.
So it's an opportunity cost argument?
The opportunity cost for who? Then we have to think about, okay, are we thinking about the public as consumers, which all of them are, or are we thinking about them as workers, which most of them are too? So, I kind of reject the question because I feel like it's part of what we're trying to do is piece out how difficult it is to cost some of these things. Um, but if we look, for example, at the labor issues, this is a loser for labor, plain and simple. It's a loser for working people. You are creating easy access to a reserve army of labor that will push down wages and working conditions for not only other gig workers, but for employed people, because those same tactics and strategies often find their way of jumping from, the unregulated sector to the regulated one. So if you're talking about for consumers, now that's a more interesting question about costs, right? Because if you ask Black middle class riders, Uber's been great. If you ask someone who's been assaulted, it's not great.
So as I read your book, I thought you might have been talking about education and charter schools.
We can think about the Koch brothers and the deregulation of sort of the anti-public schooling arguments, right? But we can even think even deeper, thinking about DC, right, with the charter school movement here, right? But they had a major win in the early 2000s when Congress, after the home rule movement, the government control movement, said, okay, any DC public school building that is not in use must be surplus and sold. When it is surplus, it must be first offered at like 90% of market rate to the charter school movement. So it was a massive land grab, right? The same time that it was a rolling back of the neighborhood school model. After the Great Recession, there was tremendous pressure within the Department of Labor from the Obama administration, to make it look as if the country was recovering. And so how could we use or rework the categories of work with this independent contractor model, with this Uber stuff, to make it look as if the country was doing better than maybe many feared it was.
Do you think there may be a backlash to the way that Uber has organized and managed to sort of hegemonize transportation in some urban areas? And in particular, I'm talking also about labor
Yes.
organizing.
Yes. Yes, there is a backlash, and yes, there will continue to be. And even in DC this year, Brianna Joe, council member Ward 1, right? What did she do? She tried to get a $2 road pricing congestion fee added to Ride Hail, was only able to get a 25-cent, but still the idea that we were able to now raise $9 million a year for 12 overnight bus lines from Ride Hail alone, right? This is part of a conversation I could not have imagined, right, 10 years ago.
How can Uber be re-regulated?
Regulations around labor and the classification and whether Uber drivers are employees or not, that can be litigated or decided upon in the courts at different levels and at the state level. I think the questions around road usage and traffic, there are already places that are attempting to put caps. Then I think the last category might be data and technology and trust, antitrust sort of issues. And that's really how Uber operates as an industry, and how if it's engaged in non-competitive behavior, or if it's to what degree is its technology proprietary.
But we have great models. I mean, the good news is it doesn't have to be hypothetical, right? The US is sort of increasingly unique in the extent to which we've had lax regulation, right? Uber is required to provide workers' comp, death benefits, paid sick leave, holiday pay, right? And data rights to a host of workers in a host of countries that don't allow the company to get off the hook the way we do. But even within the US, we have huge variation, right? Seattle now has a deactivation protection. New York City has minimum wages.
Explain what the deactivation protection is.
The idea is that earlier this year, the city of Seattle has allowed for workers on these apps to have some kind of recourse to say, oh my God, I was just fired. I was deactivated, fired by the app today. I don't know why, and I don't know what to do about it. So they can appeal it, right? Prior to that, and in most cities, workers are unable to appeal any decision. Suddenly, oh, there's problems. I can't log on anymore. Well, that's a really big deal for workers who've come to rely on it to make ends meet. Oftentimes, there's problems with the app or the machine or the algorithm that fires them. So this is trying to create some accountability.
I think underlying what you're asking for, or in this context at least, it's really employment law.
There have been lots of cases about whether or not these workers are misclassified. It was actually the subject of something called Proposition 22 in California, which was the state's largest most expensive ballot initiative of $220 million were spent. And this year, a very copycat initiative is happening. Ballot initiative is being put forward in Massachusetts around similar questions about whether or not these workers are in fact employees. And what the companies are doing in Massachusetts, which is what they did in California, is they said, let's put it to a vote. Let's ask workers let's ask the public whether or not these workers should be guaranteed employee status, which is wild.
Silver Spring is a hub, according to your book, of Uber drivers. That a lot of our Uber drivers in the region come from the area of Silver Spring and Arlington, but also Silver Spring. Do you have any thoughts on why that is the case?
A lot of the people we interviewed might have listed their address as Silver Springs, but going back to the day,
Silver Spring Coffee, don't make that mistake.
Singular, honey.
Silver Spring. Yeah. Many of the people we interviewed are from that aforementioned city. I don't know to what degree that's a sample that we can trust. Yeah.
Right. If it's just what we were accessing. I mean, that's part of it. Like, we don't know. Like, is it maybe what we found is representative, maybe it isn't. It's hard to know. What we do know is that even for DoorDash, one platform alone, we know last year there were 50,000 unique drivers in the DC area. Okay, Mayor Bowser announced that. Okay, so we can only imagine the size and the scope of the Uber driver population over the last decade. That being said, part of this is a sampling issue of like how we did recruitment and where we met people. That being said, it's not hard to imagine why more people live in Silver Spring that drive for Uber than those that live in Cleveland Park. I mean, come on, some of this is like a working class issue. It's an immigrant issue.
But you compared Silver Spring to Cleveland Park, but you could also compare Silver Spring to other parts of DC that are closer in demographics and socioeconomics.
Sure, like Benning. I mean, absolutely. But I don't know that but I will say, but I do think in terms of resources, and this is just me guessing, I do wonder if the access to a car is more readily accessible for families or individuals that are living in some of the suburbs than those that are living in Northeast or in certain parts of DC that are not Cleveland Park.
Did you see any ethnic breakdown of drivers? And do you think that tells you anything? And I'll tell you, Silver Spring is one of the biggest areas for Ethiopian immigrants. Were Ethiopian immigrants overrepresented in the racial makeup of Uber drivers?
I mean, you can say overrepresented, but I would actually say accurately represented, because we can also think about the taxi and chauffeur industry. It was Eritrean, it was Ethiopian, right? From the 1990s to 2000s, right? It was a steady way for families, for recent immigrants to make money. We know that the gig workforce is majority people of color. It is majority immigrant, right? It's a new stop after Ellis Island, right? In our imaginary about how immigrants work. So I don't know that I would say they're overrepresented, but I would say that they are a significant part of the population.
Declan did a number of interviews with...
Edit note, Declan Cullen is the third author of the book Disrupting DC. Back to Kafui Atto.
They are Ethiopian drivers who had started as black car drivers. And so when it was Uber Black, it really does, I would assume it skewed in that direction, because the black car and, livery.
You had to have a license. You had to already be a taxi driver. You had to already be that.
Yeah, so it probably would have even skewed more in the kind of immigrant and direction earlier. And then when it opened up to Uber X, where it's people outside of the taxi industry, you actually might have seen a kind of, just a more diverse, driver body.
How did Uber reset our expectation of our common purpose and our commonwealth?
Uber has allowed us to live individually, and it has helped us to forget about the cost of our actions.
I think, part of what we try to say in the book is that people already hate politics. Just to bring it back to the title of your show, people hate politics, and people also have very low expectations of government and what engaging in politics can do. There's a good reason for that. There has been a decades-long assault on the idea of government, the idea of the government undertaking ambitious programs of either redistribution or, development, especially at a local level. The low expectations that people have are understandable. What we show in the book is that Uber has lowered them even further. Okay, right? That Uber, by offering itself as a solution to a whole range of problems that, we think are political problems, and rooted in kind of how we've organized our society, that its ability to answer those questions has yet again pushed people away from engaging in politics, engaging in common struggles. In addition to, the part of it is it's kind of offering itself as a kind of a pseudo safety net. But Katie's point, we shouldn't forget that there is also a kind of individualizing, atomizing, and isolating quality of technology itself, especially when compared to public transit. What Uber has done is exploited that disenchantment. I mean, when you say I hate politics, it's like there's a part of it. It's like people are just disenchanted. People don't, there are a rare number of academics who have in their mind either the French Revolution or 1848 or other revolutions where people compelled by some political idea take the streets. Most people just it's like politics. I hate politics. I hate politicians. I'm totally disenchanted with the whole thing, and that's an opening for tech. And I think Uber has taken advantage of that.
Katie Wells, Kafuyato, thank you for taking the time.
Thank you, Sunil.
Thanks so much.
I'll be back with the wrap up, including lessons from my conversation with Kafuyato of the City University of New York and Katie Wells of Georgetown University, authors of the book Disrupting DC, The Rise of Uber and the Fall of the City. You're listening to I Hate Politics. I am Sunil Dasgupta. You're listening to I Hate Politics. I am Sunil Dasgupta. What lessons can we draw from my conversation with Kafuyato and Katie Wells, who together with Declan Cullen wrote the book Disrupting DC, The Rise of Uber and the Fall of the City? First, the implied causal argument in the subtitle of the book, The Rise of Uber and the Fall of the City, is going to be hard to identify clearly. Uber is only one of the many big tech firms engaged in disrupting our lives. And the gentrification of Washington, D.C., including big increases in tax revenues and budget surpluses, have hidden in plain sight the more undesirable consequences of Uber's business model, particularly for labor and insurance costs. Making the argument on behalf of all big tech is somewhat easier than it is for Uber alone. But make no mistake, Uber, as Kafuyato calls it, is really one of the unicorns. It entered the highly regulated industry of local transportation, disregarded existing laws, made the case for new laws, mobilized its users behind it, and upended local governance itself. DC, as Katie Wells pointed out, was a relatively easy target. 13 council members without a higher state government with preemption powers. DC was also a textbook case in the failure of government, from schools to taxis. Unable to fix government itself and offered the opportunity of an easy technological solution that did not require the sacrifices and hard work of political resolution. DC residents, its leaders, and consumers jumped at it. We all really hate politics when we come right down to it, and want solutions that do not disturb us mentally or cognitively. Given the state of the Washington Metro and the old taxi cab commission, the arrival of Uber did indeed reduce some social costs. But was that mitigation greater or lesser than the social cost Uber itself has imposed on society? Both Wells and Atto argued that the real tragedy of the rise of Uber was the foreclosure of future possibilities for Washington, D.C. as a collective, not merely the convenience of its upwardly mobile population. Yet, both Atto and Wells are optimistic that Uber and other big tech firms can be brought back under regulation. But what they neglected to say is that it will require massive political will, electoral mandates, visionary leaders, all of which are precluded because Uber occupies this big political, cultural, and economic space. Where will the leaders come from? Based on the book and our discussion, that question seems almost science fiction in its framing. Consider this. Who is the leader who will say, let alone actually lead us away from the pursuit of individualistic benefits of rideshare apps like Uber and turn us towards the collective good of public transit? At the heart of the rise of Uber is the hatred of politics and government, and by extension of the collective. No matter how much we make rhetorical talk of community building, what is the remedy to the layman's apathy and aversion to engagement in issues which concern collective good? The exploitation of our disenchantment with politics by those who control new technology, and conversely, how we push back against them could very well be the essence of contemporary politics. Intersecting with class and race, this is the politics we play. We have a real life issue in the Washington, D.C. area today. How will we fund the $750 million gap in the Washington Metro funding? How will we rewrite the Interstate Compact, which is the basis of Metro, to establish a long-term financial arrangement for public transit? It is easier just allowing Uber to operate. That's all for this episode of I Hate Politics, where we aim to stem the decline in local news by working with community voices. I Hate Politics is produced by me, Sunil Dasgupta, and assistant producer Daniel Galileo, with support from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. I direct UMBC's political science program at the universities at Shady Grove in Montgomery County, where, among other things, we explore and learn about politics, government, and society close to home. Music for this episode comes from Washington, D.C. composer, songwriter, and pianist Oren Levine. We pulled music from his album Making Up for Lost Time. Barbara Papendrop and Aaron Myers on vocals, Lionel Lyles on tenor sax, and Herb Scott on the alto sax. You can find more music from Oren Levine at ohljazz.com. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone else who might want to, please email us at producer@ihppod.org. I hope you'll subscribe and share the podcast as we bring you stories about politics close to you and to your home. See you next time.